A Soviet Union B-59 submarine was hiding underwater in the Caribbean Sea, just a few kilometers away from the U.S., ready to attack. The U.S. Navy got wind of it and started dropping small bombs underwater to force the submarine to surface. The submarine, which had lost contact with its headquarters thousands of kilometers away, had its captain thinking that maybe war had broken out and it was time to launch nuclear torpedoes. Tensions between the U.S. and the Soviets were at an all-time high. Thousands of nuclear missiles from various countries were just a button press away. The captain of a Soviet submarine was about to launch a nuclear missile when suddenly something happened that saved the world from disaster. This incident took place during those 12 days in history when the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was spiraling out of control. Here's what went down. The whole world had witnessed the aftermath of the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II, including the frightening side of America. The Soviet Union was the only country that could really challenge America's power after World War II. They were the second country to successfully acquire nuclear technology right after the war. By conducting several nuclear tests, they indirectly signaled to the U.S. that they weren't like Japan, who just sat quietly after the attacks. This was during the Cold War, when both the U.S. and the Soviet Union kept their nuclear weapons ready at all times, whether for a ground attack or not. Everyone knew that if either the air or the sea made the first move with a nuclear attack, the next country would retaliate with its own nuclear missiles. The devastation would be far worse than the nuclear bombings in Japan, to the point where it was believed that maybe 70% of the human population could vanish. To make these attacks even more effective, American and Soviet bomber aircraft were constantly in the air, and their nuclear submarines were patrolling international waters, keeping a close watch on each other. She was just waiting for a signal while hiding. Besides, the U.S. had also installed its nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy because both countries were NATO allies and very close to the Soviet Union's border. This made America's position much stronger, as it would be easier to attack the western part of the Soviet Union from there. But when the Soviet Union caught wind of this, they decided to install their nuclear weapons closer to America. The best spot for that was just 200 kilometers southeast of the U.S. Back then, Cuba was a whole different story. It had a pro-communist government that the U.S. just couldn't accept. In America's eyes, Cuba was aligned with the Soviet Union, which was basically the heart of communism. Communism means that all businesses are controlled by the government and everyone gets an equal share, so you wouldn't have classes like rich and poor. Meanwhile, the U.S. wanted capitalism to run the show everywhere. A free market where anyone could start a business and make a profit. The U.S. wanted to attack Cuba to bring about a change in government, but Cuban President Fidel Castro had the support of the Soviet Union, which supplied Cuba with weapons. However, while trying to build good relations with Cuba, the Soviet Union had its own agenda. At that time, Soviet President Nikita Khrushchev made a secret deal with Fidel Castro in which they agreed to install Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, in Cuba, and in return, the USSR would back Cuba against the US. It'll help protect us from attacks, but another benefit was that this way, Soviet nuclear warheads could easily hit the South American region. No one had a clue about this deal, and the Soviet Union started secretly installing its ICBMs in various locations in Cuba. However, this news had spread like wildfire all over America, creating fear and panic among people, knowing that Soviet nuclear missiles were set up just 200 kilometers away in Cuba. The White House denied all these reports. During the 1962 state election campaign, people were assured that all the rumors were baseless. However, in the search for the truth, the U.S. Air Force used a U-2 spy plane. The spy plane took pictures over Cuba, clearly showing medium-range R-12 and intermediate-range R-14 ballistic missile facilities. These photographs were enough to prove that the Soviet Union had tightened its grip against the southeastern part of the United States. This news reached American President John F. Kennedy, but they struck like lightning and decided to teach Cuba a lesson, especially since the U.S. was already pretty angry with them. The plan was to take out the Soviet ICBMs first, with airstrikes, and then go all in to seize Cuba, which was long overdue for the American president. This plan was basically an invitation to World War III because attacking the Soviet missiles in Cuba would be seen as an attack on the Soviet Union itself. And if that happened, it would lead to a major conflict from both sides. If a nuclear war broke out, it would be impossible for anyone to control it. On the other hand, when the Soviet Union got wind of America's intentions, they geared up to respond to any attack. One of the preparations included a Soviet B-59 nuclear submarine, which was mentioned at the start of this video. It was ordered to hide deep in the Caribbean Sea near Cuba. The submarine's crew had full authority to launch nuclear torpedo missiles if war broke out, without needing to wait for permission from Moscow, all while staying under the radar of the U.S. Navy. The submarine had gone so deep that it had lost radio contact with Moscow. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy also got suspicious about the Soviet submarine being in the Caribbean. They dropped small bombs at that location to signal the submarine to come up and identify itself. These bombs were actually signal depth charges, a type of anti-submarine weapon that could completely destroy the submarine if they exploded nearby. Inside the Soviet B-59, the captain, who had already lost contact with Moscow, was... It seemed like war had already broken out, and it was time to launch the nuclear torpedo missile. The crew had full authority, but before pressing the nuclear button, it was crucial to get the agreement of all 3 officers on board the submarine. Out of the 3, 2 officers were all for firing the nuclear torpedo, while 1 officer was against the attack. The executive officer, Vasili, got into a heated debate in the archipelago. Arkhipov was arguing that launching the nuclear missile was way too risky, especially since they didn't have any confirmation that a war had actually started. The debate went on for minutes, and then it was decided to bring B-59 to the surface and re-establish contact with Moscow to get a real sense of the situation. At the same time that all this was happening on the B-59 submarine, there was a meeting between the Russian and American presidents to neutralize the escalating tension. They agreed that the Soviets would pull back their nuclear missiles from Cuba, but only if the U.S. wouldn't end up taking control of Cuba afterward. That was the deal presented to the public, but it later turned out to be different. The U.S. secretly agreed to pull its nuclear missiles out of Italy and Turkey too. This intense period lasted for 12 days, and now the world knows it as the Cuban Missile Crisis. During those 12 days, tensions skyrocketed, and both countries even sent their nuclear missiles into space. That meant if we survived and war didn't break out, those missiles would be destroyed in space. But if things went south, those missiles would come right down on their targets. But now this crisis was over. These nuclear missiles were blown up in space. The B-59 submarine contacted Moscow when it reached the surface in the Caribbean, and they were ordered to head back to the Soviet Union. Historians believe that Executive Officer Vasili Arkhipov is the reason we're able to live in this world today because of the crucial decision he made on that date. Otherwise, the nuclear war would have been so intense that there might not have been any humans left at all. I hope you all will like and share this video too. Thanks so much for all the love in the comments. See you in the next amazing video.